In the previous video we created the referee input screen, and the entire process was quite long-winded as well as very detailed, especially because of the fact that we wanted our goal scorers to be displayed dynamically. So for example, we wanted the ability to easily add and remove new goal scorers. In this video we're going to focus on creating the ability to edit the information specific to each team, and this is going to be a lot more straightforward than the previous section, especially because we have half of the code already in place, the code required to actually display the data about each team. So across in NetBeans I've gone ahead and opened up the team model and the team controller. We're going to need to create a new page to actually control exactly what's going to be displayed, and so to do that I'm just going to create a copy of the team profile page, and we're going to rename it to edit. We're then going to need to add this into our team controller, and so we can do that simply by duplicating the current profile page and changing the render profile to render edit. We also need to change the name of this method to edit. If we save that now and go across to our browser, we should simply be able to change the name of this page from profile to edit, and it will display all of the same information. In our edit page, however, we're not going to display any team results or player details, and so we can delete these 3 lines. If we were to go ahead and render this page now, we would get an error message because we're still trying to actually render them. And so we can delete these 3 sections as well, which all relate to the fixtures, the results and the goal scorers. And this will leave us with just the information relevant to the team. So if we refresh the page now, we're left with only this single section. Now we're going to actually want to edit this section. At the moment this is just displayed in a table, but we're going to want to change these into input fields so that we can obviously change the details within them. To do that we're going to need to create a copy of the team profile template, and so we can do that simply by copying this folder and renaming it team profile edit. We will also need to do this with the actual file name as well. And to then access this, we're going to need to change these details. So in order to constantly check that we're still working, we can check this again in our browser, and if we refresh, we can see that we've got an error. This is because we haven't actually updated the name of the profile page yet within the template itself, which we need to do at the top and at the bottom. So if we refresh our page again, we're going to get the correct display. This means that we now have an independent template which we can go ahead and work on without actually impacting the actual profile page template. So rather than just outputting these variables as text, the next thing that we can do is to convert these sections into actual input boxes. And we're going to use a paper element to do this for us, which is called paper input. Now, because this is a paper element, we're also going to need to import this as well. And this will be in the same folder as all of the others. So paper input, paper input. We're also going to want to specify a label for this. In this case we're going to specify manager as the label. And we're going to set the label type It's a float label. In fact, this should be floating label, not float label. And we refresh the page. We're going to get this input box. If we click into it, we're obviously going to see the fact that the label is moving above the input section. When we click out of it, the label moves back down. If we type into the input section, the label is going to be remaining above the actual input itself, which means that we can then remove these labels themselves. You will notice, however, the fact that the value didn't populate here automatically, even though it is inside of the element. And the reason for this is that we need to specify this as the value. Refresh. It's going to populate that for us automatically. And because we have our table labels correctly now, we can remove the fact that this is all going to be in a table. We will transform this into basically just a list of elements. We remove all of these TDs because we're obviously not going to use them anymore. And we can use our current paper input template as a template for the other input sections. So we have the ground name. We have the capacity. Have the ground address and the contact number. And I'm also going to remove the colons from these sections just for consistency. So if we go ahead back across to our browser and refresh again, you can see that we have all of these input sections. We are also going to want to add a submit button as well, however, and so we can do that while we're at it. And we can basically use the same input button which we used in the past, which was the paper button, which again we're going to need to import. With the button we need to actually specify the name, and so we're just going to type save here. We're going to type, it's going to be button, and we're going to set it to be raised. We will need to add all of this inside of a form as well, and we'll come back and do that later on. If we come back across to our browser and refresh our page, we will see that we also have the addition of this button now, which is exactly what we would expect. Now you may be looking at the team logo and thinking that we also need to handle this as well, and you'd be correct. However, we're not going to actually upload the files to our server. We're only going to store the link to the picture file on our database, and we're going to rely on the teams themselves to host the image file, whether that's on their website or somewhere else. We do, however, need access to that location, and so we're going to create another input box specifically for that. So back over in NetBeans, I'm going to copy and paste this. Just going to format everything. And I'm going to change this to logo. And we're just going to change that to Team Crest. Back across in our browser, if we refresh the page again, we're going to get this URL. It happens to be local in this example, but as I say, this will be hosted somewhere else other than our local website in a real world example. And so you could, for example, change this to a complete URL. We're not going to do that in our example, however. Now you did at the same time see real world example of this image changing, and that's because this data item is bound to this field. Because they're both referring to the team crest, Polymer actually joins them together. And so when we changed this, it was actually redirecting to somewhere else, and we weren't getting the actual picture displayed, because this location doesn't exist on our drive. This is going to be quite useful because that means that when we're actually updating the picture in the future, we will be able to test whether it's actually a valid link or not before we save the page. And so we're not going to actually remove the image itself for that very reason. Just because we've used buttons in the past, I'm actually going to go ahead and convert this into what Polymer calls a fab. This is going to be a separate stylized button which is going to help that feature stand out. And we don't actually have the raised property that we can deal with, nor do we need to specify it as a button. If we go ahead and refresh the page, you'll see that it actually displays as a circle button. And because it's a circle, it does help draw the user's attention. Now we obviously don't want it to be a blank circle, we want to actually have an icon in there. And to do that, all we need to type is icon equals, and then the name of the icon, which will give us a save icon. And this just helps us differentiate this as being an important feature within this form. We could also go ahead and stylize this so that it actually matches our colour scheme. Obviously red stands out a little bit too much, so we can specify it to be the same colour as this. And so back across in NetBeans we can simply type style, colour is this colour, and if we refresh again, it's actually changed the foreground colour and not the background colour, which is not what we wanted. So if we change that to background colour and refresh again, it's going to fit into our colour scheme a lot more. So you can see at the moment everything is currently listed horizontally from left to right. This is not how we want it to be displayed on our actual final version of the form. We want each element to be listed one on top of each other. Back across in NetBeans we can go ahead and resolve this issue. And we're going to actually import another element, this time called the core field. And all we're going to do is we're going to wrap the core field around each of these existing elements. I'm just going to spread this out again so that it's clear exactly what's happening within each element. We will deal with the image itself later on. If we come back across to our browser, however, and refresh our page, we can see that each of these is listed going vertically down the page. And we can do the same thing with our core field for our actual logo. We are, however, going to remove the left align. And indeed, the team logo formatting, or rather the float left aspect of it. We can then go ahead and remove the clear fix which we've applied to the bottom. If we refresh our page again, this is going to give us all of our elements on the left, with our team logo which is currently centered. Because we have the space available to us, we do want to make these input boxes 100% of the width available to them, so that they take up the entire space. And so to do that, we can just style our paper inputs. And refresh our page. Our input sections are styled for us. So the next thing that we're going to need to do is to actually submit this as a form. To do that, we're going to go back across to NetBeans and we're going to create a form within our template. Unlike our previous example, we're only going to have one form for this entire section instead of multiple sections on a single page. So we can simply have an action and we're going to set the method to post. So in order for us to submit this form, we're going to need to give each of these elements a name. And we're going to use the same names as they're stored in our database. So this will be Team Crest. This will be the Team Manager. Ground name. We then have the capacity. And the ground address. And the team contact. If we go back across to our controller, we're also going to need to check whether a variable is set here so that we can actually determine whether we should import data into our database or not. And so to do this, I'm also going to go ahead within our form and create a hidden input type. Which we'll call run. And we will have the value of true. And we will look for this specific field to check whether a form has already been submitted or not. And so if we actually copy across our information which we used in our results section, we can copy this part of the code across. So if run is set, we're going to run update team input data, which is a method that we will create now. And within this, we're going to do the exact same thing as we did with our results. So again, we can copy the results model. So first off, we're going to have run, which is going to have the value which is set for the run command. This is always going to be true in our case, and so we're not really going to use this in our import command. We will, however, have the team ID, which we will generate from the team name, which means that we also need to pass across the team name. And so again, we can do this in a hidden input field. So if we come back across to our model, we can go ahead and just output all of the information which is included in our var dump for the post. Just so that we can test that this part of the form is working properly. If we go back to our page and refresh, the submit button isn't obviously going to work yet, which is going to be our next priority. So in order to make this work, we're going to need to go back to our template and we're going to name our form, or rather give it an ID, which will simply be main form. And then with our fab, we're going to set on click document get element by ID. called main form, and we're simply going to submit it. And we're going to need single quotes around the main form as well. If we come back across our browser, we can reload the page, but unfortunately we're not going to be able to submit the form in this way. At the time of creating this video, there's no great way to actually implement a submit button in the form of a fab without jumping through a whole series of hoops. Because the focus of this series is focused more on implementing a solution rather than jumping through whichever hoops are available, I'm actually going to revert this back to a normal submit button. But if this was a production environment, I obviously would take the time and make the fab work in the intended way. So if we go back here, I'm going to delete all of this. And I'm simply going to instead have a button, which is of the type submit. If we go back across to our browser and refresh again, you can see that it's very simple, but this time when we click it, it will submit to the actual page, which is the intended behaviour. You can see, however, that we're getting these error messages, and so we can go ahead and work on these, and they relate to the team model page. So for now I'm just going to move this var dump and die above these sections so that we can actually see that we're getting our data across. So if we go back and refresh our page and then submit again, we are going to get the team name passed across. Because these paper inputs don't actually extend the input type, we're going to need to create hidden input types for each of these and then bind the data across in the same way as we have done here. So I'm just going to create 6 replicas of this. And copy all of the data across. And this one should be ground address. So if we go back across to our browser and go back and reload our page and then submit it again, we're going to get all of the information that we need across. So in our team model we can go ahead and address the error messages that we were getting. I'm going to move this down to the bottom so that we can actually see the data as well as the error messages that we're getting. So if we reload this page with the data already submitted, and we're getting this error message because SL, or Stretch League, hasn't been instantiated in this class. We did, however, instantiate it when we were dealing with the results input. And so we can go ahead and do that now. And so if we go ahead and refresh our page, those errors are going to go away. And remember that we want to actually whitelist all of the data that's getting passed across. And so we're going to use this version of the data. So the next input that we're going to look at after the team ID is going to be the team crest. And so if we refresh our page again, you can see that we're getting the correct outputs for each of these. We also have team manager, ground name, capacity, address, and contact number. So if we go back across to our page now and refresh, we can see that we have an actual element which corresponds to each of these. And so we now no longer need the actual post data. So we can delete the run, as well as any reference to post. If you look at the data, you can see, however, that this has taken out the spaces between the words as we recorded them. This is because we're filtering each of these fields, and for some of them we're not actually going to want to do that. And so we're not actually going to want to do that for any of these. And so we can delete the filter variable. And if we go back across our browser, we can see that this is going to give us the information exactly how we put it into the form. Now you may think that this opens us up to SQL injection attacks, but there are, however, two important factors. First off, this is going to be only used by people who are actually responsible for the league, and so this minimises the opportunity. But most importantly, when we're actually importing it into the database, we're actually binding it across, rather than using it as raw variables. The PDO database extension which we're extending actually accounts for this, and it treats the data which is being binded across rather than being part of the SQL statement itself as being potentially harmful, and therefore it doesn't execute any of that content. So we're not actually open to SQL injection attacks, even though it may look like we are. So now that we have all of the data posted across, there are two things that we need to do, which is simply to update the team table and the grounds table, because this data belongs in two different tables within our database. Before we do that, however, we can simplify our code. In each of these instances we are creating a new instance of the Stretch League, and so we can move this all into a public variable which will be shared across all of them, and we can move this instance of it into our constructor. This means that instead of having this Stretch League, you can simply replace that with this SL. This will make our code more efficient, because it does mean that we're not going to be instantiating this every single time we want to do something with it. So when it comes to updating our database, we're going to create a new method within our Stretch League function, which will actually handle that for us. And all we're going to do is pass all of these variables across. So we're going to pass across the team ID, team crest, team manager, grounds name, grounds capacity, grounds address, and team contact number. You can delete this for our dump as well. When we create this function, this method, we're obviously going to need all of those pieces of data, and we're going to simply type this db update. And if we go across to our database, we can see that we're going to need the table, the data, and the where conditions. So the table is going to be, for this first one at least, team. The data will be an array, and the where condition will simply be team ID is equal to, and then we will append our team ID. because we're going to use our team ID as our unique reference. When it comes to the data that we're going to add in, however, we're going to need to create our array completely from scratch. So we can go ahead and do this. And remember that we're not actually dealing with the grounds information yet. That's all stored in a separate table. So we're also going to deal with the team manager here. And the team contact number as well. So if we format that, so we can copy this down and reuse the code to update our grounds table. We don't, however, have our ground ID, and so we're going to need to select that from our team table. And we're going to store the output in ground ID. And all we're going to do is we're going to select ground ID from team, where team ID is equal to the team ID. And we're going to need the ground's name to be able to change. The ground's capacity. And the ground's address. So I'm just going to add in a die after each of these. And we're going to test that this is working properly. So if we go back to our page, the first field that we're testing is the team crest, so we're going to submit the same URL with a number 1 at the end, even though the image doesn't exist. So if we save this, if we go back and reload our page, we can see that this has already been saved into our database. And so we know that our team section is working properly and we didn't get any error messages. If we move the die down, we're going to want to echo out the ground ID. So if we go back and reload our page, and we change this back and submit again, it's giving us an error message, which it would do, and it's because we're trying to use this array as a string, which we're trying to do down here. So we're going to need to add a 0 after this, because we're going to want the first instance returned from this. Remember, this is going to return every single instance where this is the case. We can even limit this to 1. But it's still going to give us the same error message. If we refresh again, we know that we're definitely getting 1 returned. So instead of trying to echo this, we can confirm that we're getting the right information by var dumping it. So if we refresh our browser again, you can see that we need to access index 0 and then the ground ID. So we can add the ground ID to our string down here, just so that there's no question about it later on. So if we remove this var dump and we move the die down below this part of the query, and we reload our script again, we're not going to get any error messages. If we go back and we want to change our location of our ground, we can change this to West Park 1. And then when we come back to this page and refresh it again, it's going to save it as West Park 1. And so now that we know everything's working, we can delete the die. And this page is more or less complete now. We could of course add any capacity we want and it will save for us. And if we go back to our profile page, we can see that the capacity has updated in our database. So in this section we've gone ahead and created a custom form for our teams so that we can manage their information. This is obviously much easier than creating the dynamic form required to input goals for every game, which we created in the previous 3 videos. And in the next video we're going to create another form very similar to this, but instead of managing the team's details, it's going to be used to manage our referees' details. So specifically we'll be able to use it to change the referees' names, if they were to change for any reason. So make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss out. So if we refresh our page, we can see that because we haven't input a referee ID, we're getting a strange error. If we select a referee, we can see that we get their information out.